Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got another one that I've been very anxious to get in to do. It's going to be a couple of very big beers, contrasting styles, but they share common elements. These are both big, bold, flavorful beer styles, and I expect today's are going to be quite enjoyable indeed. We're going to be starting off with a brewer. I've never had anything from them ever, so this will be the first. This is Rahr, R-A-H-R, and Sons Brewing, bourbon barrel aged winter warmer. Clocks in at 11% ABV. They are based in Fort Worth, Texas, and this has the recognition, at least on the Beer Advocate ratings, as being the #1 ranked barrel aged winter warmer that there is in the world. So it is the #1 ranked for the style. Moving on to number 2. This is Novo Brewing's. We've had quite a few of their beers, but it's been a while. This one's called Nevermore. It's a bourbon barrel aged black barley wine that clocks in at 11.6%. And this one was brewed with additives, namely cocoa and smoked figs. Novo is based out of Portland, Oregon. So we've got two big, bold beer styles. One that is ranked the top in the world for its category on Beer Advocate. And they're both bourbon barrel aged. And they're just 0.6 ABV apart. So I'm expecting that these are both going to be thoroughly enjoyable and have a lot of similarities, even though they're distinctly different styles. So I can't wait to jump in. I'm going to do exactly that. We're going to get things kicked off with the Rahr Sons Brewing Bourbon Barrel Aged Winter Warmer. This one clocks in at 11% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's big, bold, dark beer review, we have got Rahr Sons Brewing Bourbon Barrel Aged Winter Warmer, 11% ABV. They are based out of Fort Worth, Texas, and it holds the distinction of being the #1 rated for the category on Beer Advocate. This is going to be the first beer I've ever had by this brewer, and I'm always excited to try new beers by new brewers. And this is such a great style, and you don't find them year-round typically, so I'm very, very pleased to have my hands on this one. So starting with the label art, it's got a guy hoisting, he's like riding a keg like a bull and hoisting a mug of beer. So, I mean, it just doesn't get much better than that. And it looks like maybe there's a Christmas tree behind him. Tough to say. But what I do know is I'm very excited. So let's get this cracked. Gently. Gently. All right. And poured right in the glass. All right. Okay, right off the bat, this is looking right exactly in the color range that I know to be the standard for winter warmers. They can run the gamut in terms of color. Some can be darker, some can be lighter, but they do tend to be kind of sort of porter colored. So it's a dark, dark brown. It's not pitch black, but they're very, very dark. Okay, out of the gate, I can tell you this beer has a very, very pungent aroma. I can smell it from here. I'm a good 1.5 feet from the edge of this glass. So first thing visually, holding it up, yep, it's very dark. It is not quite pitch black. I can just see light coming through in the thinner part of the glass, but it is very, very dark, even for a winter warmer. Formed a little bit of a head. We'll see how it holds. And there's a reasonable bit of carbonation I can see working up the side. So let's get right up over the glass and see what we smell. Oh, that smells so good. Yeah, and this is exactly why I thought these two beers would pair well together in a big, bold, dark beer review. Different styles, but this bourbon barrel really comes through strongly. And underneath it are very big notes of figs and toffee and caramel. So it's got elements about it that put one in mind of a barley wine. Though the barley wine has some additives and it's a black barley wine, which will be the first I've ever had. So I'm very curious to see how these two compare to one another. Nonetheless, it looks great. It smells great. Let's jump right into this Rahr Sons and see what this is about. Mmm. 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 Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. Wow, that's a big beer. Oh, the layers of flavor are intense. And just beautifully put together. Okay, yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. This is absolutely fantastic. I am loving everything about that first sip I just had. First thing, when you get it in your mouth and you agitate around the palate, the bourbon immediately makes its presence known. And it starts to take on flavor profiles that put one in mind of barley wine. It really, really does. And barley wines and winter warmers do share a lot of common flavor elements. So that's another reason I thought they would pair well together in a review. But this is distinctly different. Underneath that, the bourbon comes through, and then kind of those fig aromas you could get that kind of mixed with the bourbon and the caramel and the toffee, that comes through quite clearly. But then it starts adding in this much more roasty edge. You'll notice that this is quite a dark beer. And most winter warmers are. They aren't all, but most are. And that adds this additional dimension and layer of depth and flavor to the beer style that does help it distinctly contrast from a barley wine, though they do share a lot of commonality. High ABVs, a lot of the same processes. But for this specific beer, there's a lot of really deeply richly roasted malt character that comes through. And it's adding notes of rich cocoa and coffee, but it's not like a French roast or an Italian roast, a very deep roast. It's not even remotely imparting any kind of edge of burned or smoky quality to it at all. It's almost like just a really nice Arabica, kind of a mid-roast. So just a well-roasted coffee, but it's a concentrated coffee. Doesn't put me out of mind of maybe a more concentrated cold brew. It's just that intensity of that flavor, and it mixes with these rich fruit and the caramel and the toffee, and then just this bourbon on top, and it is just magical. And I'll tell you, the flavors, they are intense, and they do all work together, but this is not so big and bold as to be oppressive to, say, a beer drinker that doesn't like a beer that's quite so in your face. It is. It's a big beer. And the flavors are all there, but it's not over the top. It's restrained, and it almost kind of gives me the impression that it's just a little more elevated compared to what maybe some other brewer would come up with if they tried this. For the first beer I've had by this brewer, wow, what a great place to start. Honestly, this is going to be a tall order trying to top this if I get my hands on some more of their beers, because this is great. This is easily one of the best, if not the best winter warmer I've ever had. And I love this style, but have mercy, this is delicious. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel. The body, it's a solid medium heavy. It's maybe just a shade lighter in terms of breadth than you would anticipate, but it's not a light beer. It does have presence. The mouthfeel is a bit more viscous, has a bit more resistance than I anticipated for the style in the ABV range. It's really impressive. So there's a little contrast between the body and the mouthfeel, but it's not a bad thing. I can also tell you, if you start to agitate it whatsoever around the palate, it gets insanely silky. Very thick, very creamy, very silky. Not bubbles, it's just thickens, almost meringue-like in how it presents that thickness across the palate. This is just so tasty. I wish you could taste this, and I always do my best to use descriptors to help get across exactly what I'm experiencing, but this is just one of those. It doesn't matter what I could say, it's not going to do this beer justice. This is a very special beer, make no mistake about that. I'm going to jump in for final thoughts on flavor development and finish. That bourbon just hits so strong. And then figs, and almost slight notes of raisin, but that almost, the fruity side goes far more rich within that first second after the bourbon. So it's bourbon, fruit, and then rich. And then you're just getting this deep, rich cocoa and just concentrated coffee undertone that comes through. And it's just bourbon riding on the top. So it's bourbon on top and then everything else kind of below it, but they're all working together in harmony. So nothing's really vying for, oh, I'm the most important kind of flavor element here. It's all working together, but the bourbon is notably on top. It's quite a present flavor. The caramel and toffee undertones kind of mix in the middle, and they're what kind of pushes the kind of fruit vibe out of the way to blend with the bourbon and the roasty edge to the malts. And it's a very rich beer. It's a very rich beer. It's very nice. In terms of how it finishes very full. There's no hint of dryness at all. It's big, it's round, it's wet, it's thick and viscous to the end. And what is left lingering very much is equal part 50-50 bourbon and deep, rich roasted malts. There are undercurrents that will still pop in of like these caramel and toffee notes and occasionally the fruit notes, but it's almost 50-50 dead even heat bourbon and rich roasted malt. Just an absolute home run of a winter warmer, beautifully balanced. What a great way to start the first beer I ever tried from a brewer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get to our second beer of today's review, and that is Novo's Nevermore, a bourbon barrel-aged black barley wine that clocks in at 11.6% ABV. Okay, now moving on to the second beer of today's dark, rich beer review, we have got Novo's Nevermore. This is a bourbon barrel-aged black barley wine. Clocks in at 11.6% ABV. They are based in Portland, Oregon, and this specific beer has added cocoa and smoked figs. So first thing first, in terms of label art, it's very subdued, but I like it. It's obviously got a raven on there, hence the Nevermore. I've never had a black barley wine. It's my favorite beer style. I've had a lot of standard barley wines, a lot of barrel-aged barley wines, and a lot of barley wines that have other added things in them. But I'm very curious to see how a black barley wine compares to a standard non-black, the lighter middle of the road brown or kind of toffee, caramel colored, and with the addition of cocoa and smoked figs. I'm very curious to see how this turns out. So let's go ahead and get this cracked gently. All right, and poured right in the glass. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's quite a bit darker than your average barley wine. Quite a bit darker indeed. I would say this is squarely in kind of porter color territory. It is quite effervescent. That much is crystal clear. And I'm not quite going to get the whole thing in there, but that's okay. I can tell you in terms of aroma, this one's quite pungent. I'm a good 1.5 feet away from this beer from the edge of the glass, and I can smell it quite clearly. It smells really great. It smells very pungent. And it's got some interesting aromas you don't always find in a barley wine. So visually, yeah, this is significantly darker. So I think calling it a black barley wine, that's probably a pretty good categorization. This will be the first I've ever had. Head formed okay. Most barley wines aren't going to hold the biggest, thickest head around for a very long time. They do tend to be very active in terms of carbonation. This one's no exception. But let's get right up over this for a proper sniff. Oh yeah. Now I can tell you, this smells very, very malty, and the malt bill that I'm picking up does indeed put me in mind of maybe a cross between a black lager malt bill and a porter malt bill, and maybe even a strong ale malt bill. It's got an interesting aroma, and comparison to the vast majority of barley wines I've enjoyed over my many years of drinking them, this does not have that classic telltale caramel and toffee-like aroma. It smells really much more like deeply, richly roasted malts. And I do know that there's whole cocoa in here, of course, and smoked figs. And really, there's a little suggestion of smoke in there. There's a little suggestion. It maybe smells like Scotch wee heavy light. So there's a suggestion of some smokiness, some peatiness, without it being super, super present, and a noticeable absence of the caramel and toffee undertones you normally expect in the aroma profile of a barley wine, as well as all the deep, rich fruit. Now, figs are a very common aroma and flavor that you get in barley wine, but I don't really get them. The smokiness is covering up that kind of aroma that you would normally pick up figs, And there's just a suggestion of raisins and other maybe deep dried plums, like very ripened dry plums. But it smells very good, and I'm very curious to jump in. So let's jump right into here. But before I do, I should also mention, this is also bourbon barrel aged. The fact that I can't detect the bourbon on the nose, that's also intriguing to me. So this ought to be a treat. Let's dive in. Oh, it's good. It's a big beer. No question, it's a barley wine once you get it in your mouth. But wow, what a unique flavor palette. Wow. Wow. Oh, that's tremendous. This is tremendous. I don't know how many black barley wines there are out there, but I gotta say, this being the first one I've ever had, I'm already a massive, massive fan. Okay, this is every bit as big as your standard barley wine, and there's still a ton of layers of flavor. It's just the flavors you're getting out of it are completely different. They are completely different than your standard barley wine. So the first thing that I got was, as I was agitating around the palate, I was getting some of that underlying smokiness and the deep, rich roasted malt. And that was the first thing I got. I thought, okay. So it's kind of putting me more in mind with a very roasty edged porter and a roasty edge from a black lager, but with the intensity of a strong ale. And that's kind of the aroma I picked up, but then the flavor profile opened up and it's completely different than your average barley wine. There's really no sense of caramel or toffee whatsoever. It's leaning heavily on this rich, roasty, earthy side of the malt bill, and the smoked figs really come into play as well. And it's not overbearing. In fact, it's a lot milder than you would get in even one of the more mild wee heavies with the peated malts. It's a very subtle smokiness to it, but it pairs beautifully and helps increase the intensity of that roasty undertone to the malt. This is just truly delicious, truly delicious. I'm going to have to jump in for another sip here. I'm going to think about body and mouthfeel and explore these flavors again. The body is very solid, medium heavy. It's pretty much right there on the line, which at 11.6, that's, it's still normal barley wine range, but I've had a lot of heavier ones as of late, and surprisingly, this feels a lot more robust than some that I've had with 3% ABV higher on them. So, very nice body for the ABV. Certainly feels appropriate for the style. In terms of the mouthfeel, it's got some viscosity to it. It's definitely got some resistance, but it also has that classic, very effervescent barley wine kind of texture to it. You can feel it in your mouth. It's very active. And if you agitate around the palate, this one really doesn't get creamy or silky or foamy, but it just really lets you feel all the natural viscosity to the mouthfeel of the beer. You can feel that resistance there. It's quite nice. The body and mouthfeel work perfectly for the ABV, and certainly it's appropriate for the style. Now, in terms of the flavor, it's really all over the board here. This is very, very complex, but it's going to take me at least another dive or two because this is a black barley wine and the first I've ever had, and I'm having to process everything I'm experiencing. And it's very, very enjoyable, but, it's still a big, big beer. I don't want to be taking gigantic sips here. I want to take my time and enjoy this over a couple hours at least. So jump in for a small sip, pick apart this flavor. And then on that third sip, finally, that's when I detected the bourbon up front. It was taking 3, 4, 5 seconds before, but then I got it up front quite big, big punch of bourbon, big flavor intensity. And from there, it's just deep, rich roasted malts, very edge of burned beans. And I expect that those smoked figs they added in here are really laying and helping interplay that undertone. It's quite nice. It's very roasty. It's very, very roasty. It's got a very roasty malt edge to this beer. Absolutely no sense of caramel or toffee layers whatsoever, but very deep roasted malts. putting me in mind almost of a Italian or French roast coffee bean, that edge of being burned, and then that smokiness from the figs really just further accentuates that. And the figs themselves, there's a little bit of a fig flavor to the beer, but I tell you, the fig is independent from what the smoked figs are imparting. So you do get that classic hint of fig flavor in this barley wine, but the smoked figs, that's smoked figs. No, it's just adding this underlying smokiness, earthiness to this very rich roasted malt bill. It's quite nice. In terms of other things I picked up on the nose, and I said maybe like very ripened but dried plums, there is a hint of that comes through in the flavor profile. It does put you in mind of a slight fruitiness mixed with this earthy, rich, roasty, borderline smoky tone, but there's very rich, deep fruit, but it's dark, rich fruit, and really it's more intensified, like I would say it's dried, like a very ripened but dried plum. That's what's coming through. And this beer perhaps does not have quite as many layers of flavor as your average barley wine, but what you do get in this is completely different than what maybe you would be expecting, and it's just so enjoyable. But don't get me wrong, it's still very much a classic barley wine in terms of intensity and the way that the flavors interweave in and out and interplay with one another. In terms of the finish, classic barley wine is quite long. What lingers with you on this is that very roasty edge, that slight smokiness from the figs, the rich roast character from the malt bill, as well as that bourbon. And it's really equally tiered. So nothing's really vying for attention. You just keep tasting all of these flavors, and it's quite long. It really does linger on the palate. And I think the thing pushing it across the line the longest, because this is quite long, is that smoked fig side. It's really got a lingering quality on the back of the palate, and it's accentuating those natural bitters from the rich roast malts, and it's just tremendous. This is a big, complex, just incredibly enjoyable beer. I'm going to take my time sipping on this. I will come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to thoroughly enjoy both of these absolutely delicious beers, we're going to get them ranked. And I cannot overemphasize just how much I enjoyed this review and how well that they paired together for this comparison. So first, we're going to be jumping over to Rahr Sons Brewing. This is their bourbon barrel-aged winter warmer, clocked in at 11% ABV, out of Fort Worth, Texas. And this is the #1 rated beer of its style on Beer Advocate. And before we even jump into the ratings, I would say, overall, I've had a lot of winter warmers. I would say that this is probably the best I've ever had. And I've been enjoying craft beer for the better part of 2 decades. This is a very special beer indeed. So starting with the aroma. This was one of those beers that was just so pungent, and everything about the aroma was right. And it was so strong you could smell it from 1.5 to 2 feet away. It does get the perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste. Winter warmers are an interesting breed of beer. They typically do only come out in winter, and they are meant to warm you. So they're higher ABV, but you'll get some that are just built up with a big, rich malt base. Others that will have that in tandem with adjuncts. You know, they may throw in cinnamon, cloves, orange peels, stuff like that. Typical winter spices. This stuck to the just very classic formula of a big beer that was crafted exceptionally well and did not have adjuncts. So this was a very straightforward, standard winter warmer, but honestly, it was as complex as any I've had with any adjuncts. Flavor was unbelievable. It does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body, winter warmers tend to be heavier beers. 11%, this is in the higher mid-range of average ABVs for a winter warmer. They kind of run the gamut. They tend to get up there near barley wines, so they're very big, heavy beers, and it's intentional. It's to give you some weight, some warmth, and to coat the belly as you're enjoying them on a cold winter's day. This one, 11%, honestly, the body was okay. It was above average, but it wasn't anywhere near as robust as I anticipated. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the mouthfeel. The mouthfeel, on the other hand, was tremendous. It was so thick and viscous and resistant. It was exactly what I expected for the style and the ABV. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For For the finish. Finish on this beer was quite long. And I was honestly surprised, being that there were no adjunct ingredients to kind of stick out and pop and give that extra bit of life on the end of the finish. But this beer did a really great job. The flavors were quite pungent, well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the head and retention. This is another beer style that, again, and I draw this correlation relatively frequently in this review, and there's a good reason for it. They kind of go pair and pair with barley wines in terms of how the head will form and retain. They tend to be bigger beers, so they tend to be thicker, but they do tend to be also quite a bit effervescent, and that can sometimes play to their strengths and sometimes to their weaknesses. This one did certainly above average, and it did a nice job forming and held around most of the time. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the appearance, this was the exact color I picture in my head when I get served a winter warmer. Perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional, and I want to particularly point out, since it had no adjuncts, this was just strict the yeast, the water, the malt, and the hops, what they added in. And it's really a beer style that's the story of the malts and the volume and how they put it together, but just a symphony of a beautiful beer. Perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. I loved it. Subjectively, I absolutely loved it. I only docked a few points in a few categories, which were called for, but overall just a tremendous example of this style. And I subjectively loved it. Feeling in the intangible gets a 10 out of 10. And coming back to example of the style, I mean, just exceptionally well done. I absolutely see why this is rated as the #1 beer in the world for the style on Beer Advocate. I fully agree with their assessment. This is just fantastic beer at its heart. 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Rahr Sons Brewing's Bourbon Barrel Aged Winter Warmer to a 92 out of 100. This is absolute top tier beer. If you're a fan of winter warmers, I implore you to do what you can to get your hands on one of these. It will blow your mind and change your world. Moving on to beer number 2, a very interesting beer indeed. Novo's Nevermore. Bourbon barrel aged black barley wine that was brewed with whole bean cacao and smoked figs. So I didn't really know what to expect, but I knew I was intrigued before I ever got into it. I've been waiting to try this one. I was not disappointed. 11.6% ABV. They're based out of Portland, Oregon. Starting with the aroma, same story as with the first beer, just massively pungent, smell from 2 feet away, perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste really threw me for a loop. It did not have many of the classic hallmarks of a barley wine, and that is not a knock. This was almost its own beast. It was very unmistakably a barley wine, but it lacked that classic toffee and caramel undertone. And some of the fruit, they tend to have some brighter fruit with like candy sugar. This was really deep, dark, roasty, and a little bit of smoky from the smoked figs. So it was playing on the richer, denser, darker, smokier side, earthy side, versus the fruity, caramelized, sugary side. But it was equally as complex, and I absolutely loved the flavor it brought to the table. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body, 11.6. And that's in the Goldilocks zone for a barley wine. It's perfectly in average range, and the body was really impressive for 11.6 in a barley wine. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same story. This had a lot of resistance, a lot of, I don't want to call it viscous. It wasn't syrupy, but it had a little viscosity to it. It was really more resistant than anything, but also had the hallmark telltale kind of effervescence that you know of young barley wine. And this one did. And it was fantastic, 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was impressively long. Barley wines do tend to have pretty long finishes, but even compared to the style, it was really the depth of that roasty malt bill and what the smoked figs brought to the table that really extended the length. There was a bit of bourbon interplay, but it was really that rich, roasty malt paired with the smoke layers that just married with it. It just lingered on the back of the palate for, I mean, well over a minute after each sip. You could still taste it. Perfect 10 out of 10. Moving on to the head and retention. This one did okay. It formed a decent head to start, and it stuck around for a little while and then was gone under a minute. I mean, for a barley wine, They're very effervescent. They can break down, but this one did an okay job. I would say overall it was average. It gets a 5 out of 10. For the appearance, having no yardstick by which to measure, having never had a black barley wine, I give this a 10 out of 10 because it was so dark that I would call it a black beer, just like you would call any black ale or black lager. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional, and this is really the category that I was most impressed by if you take them on their individual points. I was intrigued by the beer style, and I thought, okay, bourbon barrel aging and a black barley wine, that's interesting. Let's see what this is about. And then I saw, okay, whole bean cocoa and smoked figs. It would have been so easy to go over the top and just make the smoked fig flavor profile oppressive, but it didn't. It was so harmonious in this beer, and I described it as almost wee heavy light, like Scotch wee heavy light. So it did put you in mind of that smokiness like you get from a wee heavy smoked peat, but it was light. They used the lighter hands, so the element was there and it played its part, but it can so overpower any beer. This was just masterfully executed. Perfect 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. If you can't already guess, I absolutely love this beer. My mind was blown. I'm going to keep my eyes for any other black barley wines I can get my hands on. This was an absolute gem of a beer. Perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, is an example of the style. The first and only beer by which I have to judge the category, and I was properly impressed. This goes, it's obvious that it's true barley wine. It bears so many remarkable resemblances with standard barley wine, but it's clearly its own distinct animal, playing more to the roasty malt side. And for me, I'm a lover of deeply roasted malt. That's not a bad thing. Sure, do I enjoy the caramel and the toffee and the caramelized sugar creme brulee-like qualities of barley wines? Absolutely, yes, I do. But this was its own unique animal and equally enjoyable. Perfect 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Ex Novo's Nevermore to a 95 out of 100. So only a 3-point spread, a 92 and a 95, and two absolutely top tier. I cannot overemphasize this enough. If you love winter warmers and you love barley wines, you absolutely owe it to yourself. Do yourself the favor of doing whatever you can to locate these beers, or at least something by another quality brewer of the same style, because have mercy. These both were just exceptional. They paired very well together in this review, and I did not regret 1 minute of getting to enjoy either of these beers. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the little notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.